Around midnight on April 30th, 1898, a squadron of 9 American warships dimmed their lights and slipped past the Spanish defenses guarding the capital city of Manila. At sunrise, their presence was revealed, stunning the Spanish garrison, which was entirely unaware that war had been declared between their homeland and the United States 5 days earlier. Even if they had known, they never would have expected the Americans to appear in this far-flung corner of the world. After all, hostilities between the two nations centered entirely on Cuba, an island just 90 miles off the southern coast of the United States. Manila, by contrast, was over 8,000 miles away. The sudden appearance of a hostile fleet threw the Spanish into disarray. They began lobbing ineffective shells from the shore, unsure how to respond. Commodore George Dewey, the man handpicked for the mission by Theodore Roosevelt, sat calmly in a wicker chair atop the bridge of his flagship. He knew the modern American warships under his command vastly outclassed the aging Spanish fleet. He advised his men not to waste ammunition and urged the helmsman to advance steadily, without panic or haste. Only when his forces closed to within 2.5 miles of the enemy's 12 vessels did he rise from his wicker chair and issue his now famous command: "You may fire when you are ready." The battle was over in 7 hours. Only one Spanish vessel remained afloat, while the superior American fleet emerged almost entirely unscathed. More than 200 Spanish sailors were killed, compared to a single American casualty, who died of heat stroke. The Spanish surrender and the subsequent capture of Manila marked the beginning of a new era of American rule in the Philippines, prompting one local to later remark that his country had spent 300 years in a Spanish convent and the next 50 in Hollywood. To understand the sweeping changes that the Americans brought to the islands, we must first look at how they got there. That means examining the broader context of the Spanish-American War, centered around Cuba, and 2 men, one who already held the presidency and another who would soon claim it. President William McKinley was a hesitant leader whose indecision allowed others to shape the course of American history. His passive style of governance opened the door for big business and expansionist forces to usher in a new era of American imperialism. The other man was Theodore Roosevelt, whose brash energy and behind-the-scenes maneuvering not only paved the way for the U.S. takeover of the Philippines, but also launched his own ascent to the White House. Roosevelt, the self-proclaimed man in the arena, was in truth the beneficiary of a small group of highly effective propagandists. His rise to mythical status following the Spanish-American War owed more to the hard work and sacrifice of others than to his own heroism. Meanwhile, the subjugation of the Filipino people unfolded through backroom diplomacy and high-stakes negotiation, conducted by foreign powers thousands of miles from the islands themselves. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon the relationship between the United States and its first colony, the Philippines. Episode number 2, To Hell with Spain. By financing the audacious voyage of Christopher Columbus, Spain took an early lead in the race to dominate the Atlantic world. With help from their countryman, Pope Alexander VI, the Spanish secured exclusive rights to the New World. What followed was a vast colonial empire powered by enslaved labor, extracting wealth on behalf of the Spanish crown. But that wealth was largely squandered. Instead of uplifting the Spanish people, it propped up a monarchy obsessed with funding futile wars aimed at restoring Catholic dominance across Europe. Over time, Spain's imperial holdings began to crumble. Spanish Florida was absorbed into the United States. The Napoleonic Wars prompted the Louisiana Purchase, and much of the rest of the empire broke away while Spain was distracted. Argentina declared independence in 1816, Mexico in 1821, Guatemala in 1823, and Peru in 1824. The official Spanish government website, La Moncloa, acknowledges this decline, stating, "The decline of the Spanish Empire brought about by fiscal exhaustion coincided with a gradual disintegration of the confederated system, which was subjected to centralist practices. In addition to these two factors, Spain was also the victim of its own success. The incorporation of the Americas and the expansion of transoceanic navigation shifted the European geo-economic axis from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, relegating Spain to a peripheral position." Harvard professor Graham Allison developed a theory known as the Thucydides trap, which suggests that when a rising power threatens to displace an established one, war is often inevitable. Today, that theory is often cited in discussions about the United States and China. But in the final decade of the 19th century, it was Spain and America on opposite ends of that power shift, one in decline, the other ascending rapidly. Despite the many challenges that came with the end of Reconstruction, post-Civil War America experienced a surge of prosperity. The South remained largely agricultural, but the rest of the country boomed. Waves of immigration, along with rapid advancements in transportation and communication, helped fuel industrial growth. New sectors like petroleum refining, steel manufacturing, and electric power powered an economic transformation. The frontier had been tamed, manifest destiny achieved. By the end of the 19th century, the United States had 48 states. Alaska and Hawaii wouldn't join the Union until 1959. Spain, meanwhile, was in freefall, clinging only to Cuba and the Philippines, the last remnants of what had once been the envy of Europe. After the death of King Alfonso XII, his Australian widow, Maria Cristina, became Queen Regent. The king, nicknamed the Peacemaker, had restored the monarchy following a brief experiment with republicanism. During his short reign, he ended a Spanish civil war and brought temporary peace to Cuba after 10 years of rebellion. But at just 27, tuberculosis cut his reign and life short, leaving behind his wife and their 3 young children. The peace he'd achieved turned out to be the calm before the storm. Historian Stanley Carnell writes, "Christina's only concern was to preserve the throne for the heir, 12-year-old Alfonso XIII. The liberals in Spain seized on the Cuban issue to menace the crown. Concessions, they figured, would enfeeble the monarchy and eventually lead to a restoration of the republic that had ruled briefly 20 years before. She feared them no less than she did the ultra-conservative Carlos, partisans of the pretender Don Carlos, her husband's brother. The Carlists were looking for the slightest hint of weakness in Cuba as a pretext to replace the Queen Regent with a more reactionary regime. The third and final Cuban War for Independence began in 1895. Known as the Necessary War, it echoed the Philippine struggle for freedom under José Rizal. Only this time, it was led by another writer, poet, and activist, José Martí. Martí had spent years in exile, living in Madrid, where he famously flew a Cuban flag from his apartment in Mexico, Guatemala, the United States, and elsewhere. Though deeply involved in the independence movement, he initially urged caution, warning that rapid independence could open the door to military dictatorship. Another connection to the Philippines came in the form of General Baliriano Rayler, infamously known as the Butcher. Former governor of the Philippines, the general was dispatched to Cuba to suppress the rebellion. But his brutal tactics backfired, pushing more moderates into the arms of radical revolutionaries calling for full-scale liberation. Martí's downfall, however, was that he could never find a nation willing to embrace him. Mexico's dictator forced him out after he published critical articles about the country's growing economic inequality. At the time, he had been working as a high school teacher. In Venezuela, he launched a magazine, Revista Venezolano. But the second issue's exposure of widespread corruption led to his expulsion. In the United States, Martí found many supporters, especially in Florida, where he organized exiles and raised funds. But when his followers prepared to return to Cuba with 3 ships loaded with weapons, the United States government seized the vessels. The move was deemed illegal under the Neutrality Act of 1794, which prohibited American citizens from launching military expeditions against nations at peace with the United States. The act also helped preserve positive relations with Spain. But Martí didn't give up. Just 1 month later, he made it to Cuba and launched the war with the Cry of Bear, a loosely coordinated series of uprisings across the island. At least 35 towns and villages joined the cause, creating a serious crisis for the Queen Regent. Martí would meet the same fate as his Filipino counterpart. Like José Rizal, he died early in the fight. But while Rizal was executed by firing squad, Martí died in battle, struck in the head by a bullet as he led a charge against Spanish infantry just 4 months into the conflict. General Weyler, better known by his infamous nickname the Butcher, was soon dispatched to restore order to Cuba. He immediately encountered a challenge that has plagued imperial powers throughout history: how to suppress nimble insurgents fighting for their freedom while on home turf. Spanish troops operated by the book. They marched in formation, required steady resupply, and relied on local communities for food and resources. The Cuban rebels, on the other hand, used hit-and-run tactics, lived off the land, and vanished into the civilian population. As long as the local people remained sympathetic to their cause, every Spanish soldier was at risk of being knifed in an alley. The classic solution in such situations is to win the hearts and minds of the population. It's a phrase you've heard before, used by everyone from the French in Indonesia to the British Empire, the Bolsheviks during the Red Terror, and more recently the United States in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. But you don't need a PhD in military history to know how often those campaigns failed. The Butcher didn't waste time trying to win over the Cuban people. Instead, he opted for the second play in the counterinsurgency playbook: Scorched Earth. Like General William Tecumseh Sherman during his infamous March to the Sea, the general set out to destroy everything in sight, hoping to flush out the rebels by making it impossible for them to hide among civilians. The strategy became known as Reconcentrador. Its centerpiece was the creation of tightly controlled military zones. Spanish troops, numbering more than 200,000, oversaw these districts. In order to empty the countryside of potential rebel sympathizers, over 300,000 Cuban men, women, and children were forcibly relocated from their homes. Once the population was removed, the Spanish military burned crops, destroyed food supplies, and drove off livestock, systematically eliminating any resource the rebels might use to survive. Weyler's hope was to trigger a final decisive confrontation, one he believed Spain's superior army would surely win. It was during this brutal campaign that American newspapers began referring to him as the Butcher. U.S. journalists had been closely following the Cuban struggle for independence, and the reports coming out of the island were horrifying. The reconcentration policy created overcrowded camps where food was scarce and disease spread like wildfire. Tropical illnesses and starvation tore through the confined population. Somewhere between 150,000 and 400,000 civilians likely died as a direct result of the general's tactics. Yet despite the devastation, the Cuban rebels persisted. The United States had long been interested in Cuba. Throughout the pre-Civil War era, the island was seen as a likely candidate for annexation, particularly as a potential new slave state. In 1854, American diplomats in Europe attempted to purchase the island from Spain for $120 million. But the effort collapsed when the Ostend Manifesto, a written document that argued any refusal to sell should result in a full-scale military invasion, was leaked to the press. The scandal that followed forced the U.S. government to abandon the plan altogether. Slavery was officially abolished in the United States in 1865, and Cuba followed suit in 1886. The end of this inhumane system triggered a massive industrial reshuffling on the island, especially within its dominant sugar economy. Transitioning from slave labor to wage labor required significant upfront capital and acted as a catalyst for modernization. Slavery, by its very nature, suppresses innovation. When your labor force has no voice, no autonomy, and no ability to leave, there's little incentive to invest in better processes or technologies. But with emancipation, the rules changed. American investors flooded into Cuba, eager to inject capital, install steam-powered mills, build railroads, and upgrade equipment, all in pursuit of profits from sugar exports. Businesses that embraced this new wave of modernization quickly outpaced those that didn't. As a result, a second wave of American capital swooped in to buy out struggling competitors at fire sale prices. Investors sought to achieve economies of scale and make Cuban sugar the darling of the global market. But the Cuban War of Independence, and particularly the Butcher's brutal reconcentration policy, brought the booming sugar trade to a halt. The conflict created massive losses for American investors, who quickly turned to Washington and lobbied the U.S. government to intervene, not for humanitarian reasons, but for economic ones. They wanted their profits back. They got help, indirectly, from the press. Often referred to as the Fourth Estate, the press plays a vital role in democratic societies, holding the government accountable and informing the public. But as anyone living in the 21st century knows, disinformation has always haunted the news business. The internet age may have accelerated the spread of falsehoods in exchange for clicks, but even the so-called golden age of journalism was filled with stories that prioritized drama over truth. With the bottom falling out of the newspaper industry, even highly reputable news organizations have found themselves chasing stories that sell, rather than stories that they need to tell. And this isn't just a modern problem. As historian Yuval Noah Harari puts it, humans are a post-truth species. The historian writes, "In practice, the power of human cooperation depends on a delicate balance between truth and fiction. If you distort reality too much, it will weaken you by making you act in unrealistic ways." For example, in 1905, an East African medium claimed to be possessed by the snake spirit Hongo. His message to the people of German East Africa was revolutionary: unite and drive out the Germans. To make the cause more appealing, he offered a magic potion that would allegedly turn German bullets into water, Maji in Swahili. Thus began the Maji Mahi Rebellion. It failed. On the battlefield, German bullets didn't turn into water. They tore mercilessly into the bodies of the ill-equipped rebels. Yet Harari continues, you can't organize masses of people without relying on some mythology. False stories often have an intrinsic advantage over the truth. If you want to measure loyalty, it's more effective to ask people to believe something absurd. If a chief says the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, no loyalty is required to agree. But if the chief says the sun rises in the west and sets in the east, only the truly loyal will applaud. Two men in particular played an outsized role in turning myth into reality and pushing the United States towards war with Spain: William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. Hearst, owner of the New York Journal, ran sensational headlines exaggerating the suffering of the Cuban civilians and accusing the Spanish of horrific, often fabricated atrocities. Not to be outdone, Pulitzer's New York World joined the race for readership. Together, these titans of tabloid journalism helped galvanize public support for war. Hearst famously told one of his photographers, "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." The practice became so widespread that it became known as yellow journalism. The term came from a popular comic strip, The Yellow Kid, which appeared in both Hearst's and Pulitzer's papers. It was one of the first to use yellow ink in its illustrations. But the name soon came to symbolize a darker trend, prioritizing sensation over truth. Readers may have suspected exaggeration, but the stories were gripping, and they sold papers. Ironically, both men would go on to leave very different legacies. Hearst became the inspiration for the fictional media mogul in Citizen Kane. Pulitzer, in contrast, would lend his name to the most prestigious prize in American journalism. But in this story, both were guilty of the same thing: inflaming a public hungry for drama and pushing the United States ever closer to war. That war, the Spanish-American War, was ultimately triggered by a tragic event that yellow journalism seized upon: the sinking of the USS Maine. The president at the time was the ineffectual Republican William McKinley. His lackluster performance in the nation's highest office was, in many ways, by design. Indecisive by nature, McKinley quickly fell under the influence of the robber barons who dominated the U.S. economy during the Gilded Age. Though he had the power to confront monopolies, McKinley instead welcomed them in through the front door, accepting massive campaign contributions from the country's wealthiest elites. Historian Stanley Carnow writes that the 25th president, unable to lead, was fated to follow. The son of a small-town ironware manufacturer, McKinley described himself as a simple country boy. But the Civil War changed his trajectory. He enlisted as a private in the Ohio Regiment, where his calm under fire earned the attention of Rutherford B. Hayes, a kindly Cincinnati lawyer serving as a lieutenant colonel. At Antietam, McKinley distinguished himself by driving a mule train through shell fire and bullets to deliver hot food and coffee to the front line. Hayes later called him one of the bravest and finest officers in the Army. Still, the horrors of war left a lasting impression. After the conflict ended, a 22-year-old McKinley enrolled in law school and set up shop as a small-town attorney. By all accounts, he would have been content to remain that way. But when Hayes became governor of Ohio, McKinley was plucked from obscurity and quickly promoted through state Republican ranks. Once Hayes ascended to the presidency as the 19th commander-in-chief, McKinley followed him again, this time to the U.S. House of Representatives, where he spent 14 years quietly becoming the nation's leading expert on tariffs. Abraham Lincoln's victory in 1860 had ushered in a long era of Republican dominance, with the party winning the next 4 presidential elections. Their streak was broken by Democrat Grover Cleveland, who lost re-election but returned to the White House 4 years later, becoming the first of only 2 presidents in American history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. Seeking to reclaim the presidency yet again, Republicans turned to the reluctant but dependable McKinley. By then, 2 things were well known about him. First, that he was a competent, hard-working public servant. And second, that he rarely said no. He won the election against William Jennings Bryan, though, as was often the case with McKinley's life, the victory owed more to his opponent's flaws than his own merits. Bryan had fractured the Democratic base by alienating Southern conservatives with his proposal to abandon the gold standard. This internal division plagued the Democratic Party throughout the era. The Electoral College made it impossible to win the presidency with support from just one region, and the Democrats were struggling to build a coalition that spanned Northeast elites, many of whom had embraced multiculturalism, and rural Southerners, who still clung to deeply entrenched racial attitudes. The tension proved to be too much. Bryan would go on to fail in all 3 of his presidential bids. Once in office, the naive McKinley quickly found himself in the pocket of big business. His campaign manager, a multi-millionaire political kingmaker, offered to pay off his personal debts, securing loyalty and influence. The directive passed down to McKinley was simple and unmistakable. On the eve of the inauguration, the kingmaker told him the United States must not have any damn trouble with anybody. McKinley echoed that message in his inaugural address, declaring peace is preferable to war in almost every contingency. But barely a year into his presidency, a U.S. naval fleet would sail into Manila Bay under his orders. At least technically under his orders. Earlier in his term, Senator Joseph Foraker had asked about available diplomatic postings. McKinley reportedly told him the only opening was an undesirable spot called Manila, which he admitted was somewhere away around on the other side of the world. Where exactly, he wasn't sure. By far, however, the most consequential appointment McKinley made was naming John Long as Secretary of the Navy. Because the president abhorred warfare, he gave little thought to the fact that Long had no real qualifications or experience for the job. Republican lobbyists, meanwhile, pushed hard for Theodore Roosevelt to be made Assistant Secretary of the Navy. McKinley objected, at least initially, but he rarely raised his voice. Roosevelt, on the other hand, and those around him, always carried a big stick. Roosevelt is a fascinating case of failing upwards. He loved a good fight, even when it was merely a battle of wills. After making a national name for himself in government, he found his next challenge as New York City's police commissioner. Tasked with rooting out corruption, Roosevelt quickly ran afoul of Tammany Hall, the political machine that had once propelled Martin Van Buren to the presidency and still maintained a strong grip on the city. It was an unusual place for a meteoric political rise to begin. Roosevelt had been born into one of the wealthiest families in America. After graduating magna cum laude from Harvard, the expected path for someone of his station was a prestigious job with an elite salary. Instead, he dove into the political lion's den of 19th century New York law enforcement, where challenging the status quo was often a good way to get yourself killed. At this point in his life, Roosevelt was guided by two core beliefs. The first was a lesson from his father, that with great wealth comes great responsibility. The second was a worldview he shared with classmates at Harvard, where he declared that society was split into two groups, those who govern and those who are governed. He fully intended to be the former. At just 23, Roosevelt became the youngest elected state assemblyman in New York. He immediately targeted the city's corrupt elite, moving with such speed and ferocity that the press dubbed him the Cyclone Assemblyman. But tragedy struck in 1884, when both his mother and his wife died on the same day, Valentine's Day no less. Devastated, Roosevelt left the city and retreated to the remote Dakota Territory, where he briefly reinvented himself as a rancher. He eventually returned to politics as the cowboy candidate, though his bid for mayor failed. Undeterred, Roosevelt penned a series of books before returning to public service in a federal role investigating police corruption. That brought him full circle, back to New York as police commissioner. In that role, Roosevelt armed officers not only with nightsticks but with guns. After receiving 2 pipe bombs in the mail, he temporarily stepped away from the position to campaign for William McKinley. Roosevelt was fully aware of his reputation. He once told a friend that working on McKinley's campaign would likely be the last office I shall ever hold, having already alienated so many powerful figures across party lines. Carnow writes that McKinley gave Theodore Roosevelt the post of Long's assistant secretary, but only begrudgingly. Roosevelt had enlisted powerful allies to lobby on his behalf, but McKinley initially resisted. "He's too pugnacious," McKinley reportedly told a friend, "always in such a state of mind." But the pressure eventually broke him. In April 1897, McKinley relented. Roosevelt triumphantly wired his friend Henry Cabot Lodge, "Sinbad has evidently landed the old man of the sea." Roosevelt and McKinley shared deep patriotism and a belief in manifest destiny, but they diverged sharply on how to pursue it. McKinley, scarred by the bloodshed at Antietam, was cautious and deliberate. Roosevelt, by contrast, was born into wealth and privilege. He had never experienced war firsthand. His family, like many affluent Northern families, paid their way out of the draft during the Civil War. Still, his father had donated generously to the Union cause. For young Roosevelt, who had been denied the opportunity to fight, war became something sacred, an ideal rather than a horror. McKinley, having seen the carnage of brother fighting brother, emerged from the war a pacifist. Roosevelt, untouched by the trauma, romanticized combat. He admired those who had fought and resented being too young to join them. The post-war turn towards pacifism frustrated him. He longed for a conflict that would test and validate the strength of the nation and his own. Roosevelt didn't just differ in temperament. He also believed in a more aggressive, racially charged vision of American greatness. Historian Thomas Dyer, in Theodore Roosevelt and the Idea of Race, argues that Roosevelt believed fundamentally that American greatness came from its rule by racially superior white men of European descent. When you combine Roosevelt's drive for personal glory with this supremacist worldview, the result is dangerous. A man who believed not only that war was necessary, but that it was the means through which white men could prove their superiority to all others. He was never the kind of man to quietly do his job. Karnow writes that once in Washington, Roosevelt gathered together a gang of expansionists like himself. The group included Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, naval theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan, Commander Charles Davis, Chief of Naval Intelligence, and Admiral George Dewey, now head of the Navy's Bureau of Inspections. They were joined on occasion by Charles Dana, editor of the New York Sun, and were supported from afar by John Hay, the U.S. envoy to London and future Secretary of State. Under the chandeliers of the old Metropolitan Club, they dined, plotted, and debated. Karnow called them respectable gentlemen who would have bristled at the word, but they were conspirators. Each man left a mark on history, but Mahan deserves special attention here. Born at West Point, where his father taught military engineering, Mahan served in the Civil War before launching a second career as a professor at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. There, he published The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, a foundational text in American military strategy. Mahan argued that national security and international supremacy depended on naval power. But building a fleet wasn't enough. Those ships would require coaling stations, armament stockpiles, and bases across strategic global corridors. This idea reshaped how American leaders thought about manifest destiny, not as a continental project from sea to shining sea, but as a global one, stretching from pole to pole. The implications were immense. At the time of the Battle of Manila Bay, the U.S. fleet was over 7,000 miles away from its nearest American base. The captain hesitated to fire, knowing the risk of running out of supplies. In hindsight, his boldness paid off, but the lesson was clear. Without overseas depots, victory would never be guaranteed. Mahan's ideas were not only influential in the United States. Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II wrote, "I am just now not reading but devouring Captain Mahan's book, and am trying to learn it by heart." A chilling statement, considering that Mahan predicted the next great world conflict would emerge between a declining England and a rising Germany, and that naval power would determine the victor. Shortly thereafter, Wilhelm began a massive naval modernization effort. One of the most significant outcomes of that initiative? The invention of the military submarine, the U-boat. At Newport, Mahan fostered a hive mind of like-minded naval officers who would go on to command U.S. fleets during the coming imperial era. Roosevelt, not a naval man by training, quickly became one of Mahan's loudest political champions. In one fiery speech, he used the word war 62 times, proudly declaring that all the great masterful races have been fighting races. No triumph of peace is quite so great as the triumphs of war. But Roosevelt was in no position to dictate policy, at least not officially. He was merely a political appointee, serving as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. His boss, Secretary John Long, however, proved incapable of keeping the younger man in check. Long admitted as much in his diary, writing, "Roosevelt will dominate the department within 6 months." It didn't help that Washington's sweltering summer heat, unmitigated by air conditioning, drove Long to spend the season in cooler New England. That left Roosevelt with a free hand in the capital. By June 1897, he had approved a war plan that would sound familiar to anyone acquainted with the coming conflict. As Karnow explains, it bore the imprint of Mahan's global thinking. In the event of war with Spain and the Caribbean, the U.S. Navy would blockade Cuba, while a small American infantry force landed on the island. Simultaneously, the Asiatic Squadron would show itself in the neighborhood of the Philippines, possibly attacking Manila for the purpose of further engaging the attention of the Spanish Navy, and also to improve our position when the time comes for negotiations with a view of peace. Roosevelt managed to present the plan to President McKinley, but the president remained deeply reluctant to assert American power abroad. From this point on, Roosevelt moved at breakneck pace, working to install like-minded men in key positions. One of his earliest victories came with the appointment of George Dewey as commander of the Asiatic Fleet. Dewey only got the job because Roosevelt intercepted a letter from Secretary Long that named someone else for the post. When Long returned to Washington, he learned that his deputy had countermanded his orders. He initially refused to formalize the new appointment. Ultimately, however, he relented, believing it would be unfair to penalize Dewey for Roosevelt's insubordination. Carnow tells us that at this point, Roosevelt wrote to a friend proclaiming that I am having immense fun running the Navy, as if he were in charge of the department. He was in all but title. Abounding with energy, he labored around the clock, purchasing new weapons, procuring ammunition, ordering coal, reassigning ship captains and crews, recruiting men, and reviewing deployments. The docile Long, dazed by his deputy's zeal, watched helplessly, almost regretting that he had unshackled a bull in a china shop, as he confided in his diary. There's one thing, however, that Roosevelt couldn't do: declare war. Fortunately for him, an opportunity soon presented itself in the form of a national tragedy, the sinking of the USS Maine. American business interests had successfully lobbied McKinley to position a U.S. warship in proximity to Cuba, just in case tensions escalated. The Maine was stationed in Key West, only a 5-hour steam from Havana. Consul Fitzhugh Lee, Robert E. Lee's nephew, was stationed in Havana, and despite concerns about his Confederate past and potential racial bias, he emerged as a strong advocate for the Cuban revolutionaries and a vocal critic of Spanish rule. To reassure Lee and provide a visible show of support, McKinley gave him direct authority to summon the Maine, which Lee did almost immediately. Meanwhile, McKinley worked quietly behind the scenes to prevent war from reaching America's shores. Carnow writes that Spain's embattled Queen Regent, Maria Cristina, assured him that she could handle matters as long as the United States refrained from helping the Cuban insurgents until Prime Minister Sagasta's reforms had been given a fair chance. But her position was precarious. As Carnow explains, the Queen was trapped. If America intervened, she will have no choice between losing her throne or losing Cuba at the risk of a war with us. In McKinley's mind, the best course of action was to stay calm, resist provocation, and avoid entanglement. History is often taught at light speed, making the same mistake that doomed the final season of Game of Thrones. That show rushed through months of story development in the blink of an eye, teleporting characters to where the action was without showing the slow build-up that made their choices feel earned. Minor spoilers ahead, so skip ahead about 30 seconds if you haven't watched Game of Thrones. The time jumps in that final season robbed the audience of a critical understanding, the emotional pressure, trauma, and failures that led to its female lead's dramatic turn. When she finally snapped, torching her allies and the city she once swore to protect, it felt sudden and unearned. If we'd actually seen the 9 months of pain and loss that broke her, maybe her actions wouldn't have seemed so jarring. History gets the same treatment in classrooms. were told that the Cubans were fighting the Spaniards. The U.S. sent the USS Maine to Havana, it was blown up, war was declared, we defeated Spain, and took the Philippines, all in the span of a few bullet points. But that compressed timeline unfolded over the better part of a year. Take the Maine, for example. It didn't arrive and explode in the same week. It sat in Havana Harbor for 3 full months. During that time, the officers of the Maine dined with Spanish officials, attended bullfights, and were treated with general courtesy by their supposed adversaries. Despite this goodwill, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, a key member of the Roosevelt cabal, warned the Yellow Press that there may be an explosion any day in Cuba, and that would settle many things. 22 days later, there was an explosion. Today, nearly every expert agrees it was an accident. A design flaw had placed the ship's coal bunkers dangerously close to its ammunition magazines. Heat buildup likely triggered the blast. Even the ship's captain and Navy brass said as much. But a commission was convened anyway, and 261 of the ship's 355 sailors were dead. That gave America's pro-imperial faction the opening that they needed. Dewey began war preparations immediately. Roosevelt accused President McKinley of having no more backbone than a chocolate eclair. And back home, Hertz and Pulitzer unleashed the full power of the Yellow Press, assuring Americans that the Maine had been deliberately sunk by Spanish mines. The Spanish, of course, had every reason not to provoke the U.S. They and McKinley were desperate to avoid war. While a Cuban revolutionary might have had an incentive to pin the attack on Spain, the Spanish themselves had just spent 3 months hosting the crew of the Maine in good faith. They had nothing to gain and everything to lose. 7 long weeks passed between the explosion and America's declaration of war. During that time, McKinley and his anti-imperialist allies did everything they could to slow the momentum. The president hoped, given time, Spain might resolve its internal crisis with the Cuban revolutionaries, removing the need for U.S. involvement. But the anti-imperialist camp was a fragile alliance. It included everyone from literary giant Mark Twain to protectionist business owners worried about foreign competition, to racists who feared annexation would dilute Anglo-Saxon blood, to socialists who opposed empire on principle. Aside from Twain, it was frankly a real basket of deplorables. And to make matters worse, the ship that was attacked rhymed with the enemy, giving the jingoists a perfect rallying cry. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. McKinley called for patience. He asked Congress to wait for the investigation's findings. He worked back channels with Madrid, even offering to buy Cuba outright. He requested additional war funds, not to attack, but to prepare, just in case. But eventually, political pressure made his position untenable. William Jennings Bryan, again the Democratic nominee, declared the time for intervention has arrived, and the public agreed. Carnell writes that McKinley became the target of the mounting delirium. He was hanged in effigy in Colorado. Audiences in New York booed his portrait in theaters. Even the pro-business class that had once supported peace began to buckle under the pressure. His advisors panicked. Lodge warned that unless McKinley took decisive action, we shall go down in the greatest defeat ever known. Elihu Root, an elite New York attorney, sent a blunt message to Roosevelt. If the administration does not lead instead of being pushed, it will be rolled over and crushed, and the Republican Party with it. Faced with that ultimatum, McKinley moved towards war. Spain could have avoided all of this. A peaceful resolution through negotiations with the United States was technically on the table, but domestic politics made it a non-starter. The Queen Regent, Maria Cristina, believed that conceding Cuba would jeopardize her children's future, possibly even their lives. Still, she tried. Spain ended the hated reconcentration program and floated a plan for joint rule of the island. They even hinted at autonomy, but they stopped short of promising independence and insisted that any peace deal start with a ceasefire after the upcoming rainy season. It was too little, too late. President McKinley, in one last effort to avoid war, submitted a proposal to Congress. He expected it to fail. Why? Because he knew the white Protestant supremacists in Congress would never vote for something that might ultimately grant U.S. citizenship to the largely Catholic and often mixed-race population of Cuba. Senator Henry Teller of Colorado, however, figured out how to thread the needle. His amendment explicitly stated that the United States would not annex Cuba. With that reassurance, the racists backed down. Then the pro-imperialists hijacked McKinley's bill. They amended it to endorse Cuban independence and gave the president a mandate to use military force to make it happen. Carnell writes, McKinley signed it into law. By ceding his initiative to the legislature, he had abdicated his executive authority, but he was relieved to have the burden lifted from his shoulders. In Madrid, Spain's government cabled its general in Havana to consider war as declared. Strangely, they didn't bother notifying their man in Manila. After all, Cuba had been the centerpiece of every fraught negotiation, and the U.S. was more than 8,000 miles away from the Philippines. By all accounts, it seemed to Spain as though President McKinley still couldn't find Manila on a map. This is where Roosevelt's cabal came in. Senator Lodge kept them informed of the Senate's every move. Mahan had packed the Navy with officers who shared their worldview, and Roosevelt had already sent his hand-picked man, Admiral George Dewey, and the Asiatic Fleet towards the Philippines months earlier, long before war was declared. As a result, Dewey was positioned just 5 days away from striking Manila when the war finally became official. Still, the most audacious move belonged to Roosevelt himself. He resigned his post as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to join the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry, the Rough Riders. By the end of the war, they'd be known as Roosevelt's Rough Riders. And while Teddy was certainly charismatic and larger than life, much of his legend was self-made. He brought along a personal press corps to document his every move. In reality, there weren't many pitched battles. The Spanish were already exhausted after years of fighting Cuban rebels. But one of the last major engagements, San Juan Hill, gave Roosevelt the image that would help launch his presidency. The way the story is usually told, Roosevelt charged up the hill, waving the stars and stripes, the very picture of American masculinity and heroism. But as historian Jerry Tousil reminds us, that moment was highly orchestrated. Waiting up there were 6 hand-picked reporters, he writes. They gave him the big reception. The media loved him. He was a colorful character and an adventurer. He was great copy. The full truth? Roosevelt and the Rough Riders were not alone in that charge. They were joined by the 9th Cavalry, a unit of black soldiers known as the Buffalo Soldiers. The Buffalo Soldiers had earned their name decades earlier from Native Americans who noted the texture of their hair and the fierceness of their fighting spirit, both reminders of the revered buffalo. These men had fought bravely in America's western frontier and now were doing so again, this time in a foreign war. They would later become icons of black resilience and pride, even inspiring Bob Marley's song Buffalo Soldier, which reframed their legacy as one of resistance against systemic oppression. Roosevelt, ever bold, ordered a charge up Kettle Hill, but almost immediately his horse got tangled in barbed wire, and he had to proceed on foot. He led the Rough Riders and the 9th Cavalry up the hill under heavy fire, taking it. But the real prize was San Juan Hill, just beyond. There, things didn't go quite as planned. In the chaos of battle, Roosevelt's booming voice was lost. Only 5 men followed him. Realizing how suicidal it would be to charge a fortified hill with so few, he wisely stopped to regroup. While he waited, other units, including the all-black 10th Cavalry, pushed ahead and took San Juan Hill. What happened next is one of the most forgotten and most revealing moments in American military history. Sergeant George Berry of the 10th Cavalry reached the summit of San Juan Hill. He carried 2 flags, the colors of his own regiment and those of the 3rd Regiment, passed to him by a wounded white soldier. He planted both flags at the top. Despite serving in segregated units, Berry saw his fellow soldiers, white and black, as part of a larger cause. He refused to let race divide the victory. He raised both standards together, a quiet but powerful gesture of unity in a country still deeply divided. For his part, Roosevelt praised the Buffalo Soldiers publicly and often, but the press, hungry for a hero, focused only on him. The legend of Roosevelt the Warrior was born. His myth-making machine was fully operational. He had his war, and would catapult him into the White House. And so, in a war manufactured more by ambition, accident, and media frenzy than necessity, a self-anointed master race adventurer helped lead America into empire and into the 20th century. Teddy Roosevelt didn't just ride into Cuba. He rode straight into history and to the most powerful office in the world. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on Bluesky beneath the handle EmpiresPod. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. Every little bit helps the show keep going. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.